I chose Philip Guston, I think, just initially because for some really unquantifiable reason, he is really one of my favorite artists. There's just something, there's something about the color scheme and the compositions and the strangeness of his imagery that has always really seduced me in some kind of way. He's an artist known for well, particularly for one radical change in style over the course of his career, but really there are two very radical stylistic changes that happened over the course of his life. I just always admire an artist who is able to change their way of thinking after they've invested an incredible amount of energy and thought in a particular thing. The two changes that happened for him are really interesting because they coincide with two of the really big changes in 20th century art and painting, namely the change into abstraction and then the change out of abstraction back into representation. Guston is also very much associated with New York and the New York school, the mid-century abstract expressionists, as we'll find. And I found it interesting to realize that his youth was spent in California and that he was really formed in California. Particularly at that time in the 20s, this land of really ebullient pop culture, the roadside, signage and the movies, and most particularly the funnies. This was like the golden age of the newspaper cartoons. By the early 30s, I mean, he's barely 20 years old. He really starts making his way as a professional artist, and this is the WPA era. In the 30s, as everyone knows, it was an era of enormous ideological struggle and combat, and the prevailing house style of the international art world was social realism of some kind. I mean, variants of fascist art, basically. And in America and in the circles he went in, that meant really the Mexican muralists. And I think it's interesting to note, I guess at this point early in his career, Guston is also known ultimately as a real maverick and someone who did his own kind of thing and became a very idiosyncratic artist. But throughout his professional life, he was also a real scenester in a certain way and really attached himself to the big conversations of the evolving art worlds of his time. And so in the 30s, the Partisan Review was the intellectual organ of choice, and he was a big part of these debates between Trotskyists and Stalinists, and sitting around talking about the rise of the proletariat and painting huge murals. So he moved to New York in the 30s and quickly fell in with the group of artists that then would go on to become the New York School, really the most, some of the most famous American artists of the mid-century. Anyway, by the mid-60s and definitely into the late 60s, Guston was in a real trauma about where his art was. I mean, he was very sick of doing the abstract expressionist stuff, and definitely the shelf life was fading on it. I mean, it was becoming a much more codified and just less lively kind of scene. And he began work in 1969 on this kind of stuff here, and so that's cool. This one, this Untitled one, is actually from 1969, so this is must be one of the very early forays into a new style for him. That's later. He died in 1980, so this is 78, so this is 10 years in. But what it ended up being was this very incredible late fluorescence of painting, and this is the stuff that he's really most well known for. And it very dramatically returns the figure to his artwork, and it involves many KKK hoods, lots of Ku Klux Klan members in these sort of bleak rooms. But you see the The palette is the same, like that same meat tone and like with that undertone of gray, like he gets lots of gray. Lots of these cartoony kind of gloved hands, like they're very Disney-esque sort of hands like this. And also very much, this is a big recurring motif, is this profile of this like sort of potato head with just one big eyeball. And it's kind of right here, although it's sort of obscured by that other head. But I think what really pissed people off was sort of how shitty it looks to a lot of people, you know, that it looks crude and it looks like he's faking something raw, you know. And it's, I mean, it's something that still bothers people, like a falsely naive style, because the sort of naive style has been a recurring technique of visual artists and all kinds of artists through the last 100 years. And this guy was clearly like a super sophisticated person. He was steeped in art history. He could whip out like a mural that looked like a Renaissance mural if he wanted to, and yet it's this like really crude stuff that he spent his last 10 years doing. In a way, I think there's a relationship to his move into abstraction and then his move out of it, and I think both of them have to do with an attempt to I mean, in a context of modernity and post-war atrocity, broadly speaking. Both of them, I think, are these attempts to paint authoritatively in a certain way without becoming authoritarian, or to somehow to wield the tools of painting without turning them into some kind of weapon.